Welcome to our series on working with implicit experience. I'm Lynn Preston, and I'm the initiator of this project, which coincides with the 20th anniversary of APSP, the Association for Psychoanalytic Self-Psychology. This project consists of 3 different parts. We are in the midst of a 2-part conference, Beyond Words, and we have a collection of papers, the Beyond Words collection, and this interview series. Some of us have become fascinated with the proliferation of writings and presentations about implicit experience. It seems like they're emerging from every corner of psychoanalytic thought and scientific research. And we want to know more about this, what we think of as the leading edge of psychoanalytic thinking. Some theorists seem to talk about implicit experience as a kind of new unconscious, understanding unconsciousness, what's out of awareness. And others talk about implicit as a learning, remembering mode or system, a kind of parallel system. We want to know how these approaches converge and diverge, and how they intersect to enrich each other. So I'm very pleased to be talking to Jim Fosshage today, and I'm not going to tell you all of his affiliations and credentials because it might take our whole time together, but instead what I'd like to say is that Jim is one of our primary bridge builders. He has the depth, scope, breadth, clarity, and generosity to bring theories and communities together. I always appreciate, Jim, how you cite other people's terms for things when you're talking about your own terms. That's so clarifying for me to sort of mark the similarity of territory. Also, Jim is one of the few people who can talk about the risky subject of love in the psychoanalytic situation without blushing. And of course, love is one of those deep rivers of experience that's beyond words and difficult to explicate. So let's begin with the concept of implicit. You've been interested in how scientific research broadens and supports and maybe extends psychoanalytic theory. And so maybe you could give us a feel for what the implicit dimension is in your thinking.
Sure. Thank you very much, Lynn, for your words, and also for the invitation to be here and to do this with you. I look forward to it. In terms of your introduction, what we mean by the implicit is that there's processing, organizing processing, of course, that's going on at an unconscious level. Implicit is equivalent to unconscious. Some people use non-conscious versus unconscious and then consciousness. And the reason why the people use non-conscious is because they did not want to have it confused with Freud's unconscious.
Yes.
Dynamic unconscious. So, which you well know by Freud's dynamic unconscious, we're talking about repressive forces, conflict and repressive forces that keeps things content unconscious. By non-conscious, the problem with the word non-conscious is I'm not quite willing to give up the whole word unconscious to Freud's dynamic unconscious.
Yes, I know what you mean.
That I prefer to, so I go back and forth between using non-conscious and unconscious, but with the understanding of the implicit processing that goes on, what happens is that the unconscious is expanded exponentially, far
Absolutely,
beyond,
yes.
you know, Freud's dynamic unconscious.
I think also when you don't use it as a noun, like
Yes.
the unconscious,
Absolutely.
then it's less reified,
Yes.
less about
What we're really
things.
talking about, as you know, is that we're talking about levels of awareness, and from unconscious into consciousness. And as we continue to talk today a little bit, I have a view of that as being much more fluid than even our current conceptualizing is going on between the implicit and the explicit. The explicit, by the way, is conscious activity. Between the implicit processing and explicit processing. You know, it's interesting. I mentioned at the conference that I felt that Bucci comes into this from cognitive psychology,
Yes.
and then with her knowledge of psychoanalysis, although she tends to tilt towards a classical psychoanalytic background of hers. And Frank Lockman comes in from infant research and psychoanalysis, and I come in via my work on dreams and psychoanalysis. And it's interesting in that respect, but I've always been impressed with the tremendous organizing activity that is going on in our dreams. And that dreams are really thinking. It's thinking unconsciously, but it serves all of the organizing functions as waking thinking does. And there is, from today's perspective, contemporary perspective, there's much more similarity between waking and dreaming processing than we originally thought.
The dreams are a wonderful example of
unconscious, organizing processing.
right.
Yes. So I sort of come in with that, and then with the new understanding of implicit, what is called implicit non-declarative processing, and explicit declarative processing. What we're essentially talking about is that the brain is always at work unconsciously and consciously as we're sitting here. And that implicit processing continues in dreams at night.
So this implicit dimension is a vast dimension.
It's vast.
Of knowing.
One of the
experience.
What it opens us up to is that we are learning, picking up information, both at an implicit or unconscious or non-conscious level, as well as explicit level, all the time in our waking lives. So that we take in, and it's been pretty clear and it's generally agreed upon, that the implicit processing is much larger than the explicit processing, because the explicit processing requires more focal attention. And needless to say, we can focus on things, many fewer things and less quickly than this implicit processing. So that's going on. But the fluidity between the two is very evident. For instance, when we talk about listening with the third ear, when we are simply listening and understand that the implicit and explicit processing going on, so we're thinking, and all of a sudden an image will emerge into consciousness that captures something about the patient or what they're talking about. That's the emergence of implicit processing. That's the area from which intuitive hunches come from. You know,
like in that book Blink.
That book, wonderful book, Blink, which is a beautiful book because it really addresses the massively complex information processing going on at an unconscious level. And it's very exciting to think about how much is going on.
It is very exciting that we know so much more than we can think.
That's right. We consciously think.
Then we consciously think, right.
Yeah.
You sort of make the distinction of consciously remember. I guess also, though, what's implicit isn't worded. It's known and it's ordered and intricate, but not in words. Would you?
Yeah, you know, I think that implicit processing ranges in the degree of organization, just like explicit processing does. At times it's much looser, free-flowing, bits of information are getting absorbed, somewhat loosely connected, organized. And at other times I feel that the implicit processing is probably much more focused, that we're paying close attention to what is being said at an implicit level, an emotional level. And so that there's a tremendous range. So it ranges, on the one hand, the more inchoate range is what Don Stern talks about in terms of the unformulated unconscious. And Bolas is unthought known. But even the unthought known, what is known, can be rather focused or not. But I think there's a tremendous range of organization, and I come to that really via dreams. Because I think dream mentation, there's a tremendous range of organization. At times it's loose, somewhat it appears to be sort of disparate thoughts and images together, and it's hard to quite pull them together, because at times they haven't been quite pulled together in our dreaming, and at other times it's very focused.
I think that's such an important point. And I think we're used to thinking of unconscious as not organized, but now we're finding how it's differently organized and very intricate and complex. Sort of, in some ways, more layers of organization.
Yes, absolutely. It is very complex in that way. I think the tendency, even in terms of talking about implicit, notice the term, this is one theory, by the way, that there are a number of cognitive theories running around. This one is the implicit non-declarative versus the explicit declarative. Notice the word implicit and explicit we've already talked about. The word non-declarative suggests that it's non-focused. You can interpret it that two ways. Either you cannot declare it to be remembered, or non-declarative versus declarative suggests a non-focus versus a focal attention. To that degree, it's a misnomer. Because if I'm right that implicit processing at times can be quite focused, then non-declarative isn't quite accurate. So we're still struggling, it seems to me. This is a wide open territory. This is theoretical, it's hypothetical. There's a lot of research. There are several, I might mention that there are several general agreements. One is that there's implicit processing and explicit processing, what we were just talking about, unconscious and conscious processing going on all the time. Right brain, left brain going on all the time. The second, generally accepted, and I want to get into this issue of encoding because it's very interesting, has great implications, but is that it's generally accepted that there's two major forms of encoding. Is imagistic, or the use of other visual or other sensory modalities, encoding, versus verbal encoding. I call this imagistic encoding. Pavio calls it imagistic. Bucci calls it nonverbal encoding versus verbal encoding. But maybe we can get back to that in a moment. I wanted to come back to something we were talking about, namely, one of the implications of this implicit system and the explicit system is that we learn so much more implicitly, unconsciously, than we ever thought. And one of the clinical implications is that we can understand better how patients, we will begin to frame it and understand how what they're talking about has been learned. Unconscious attitudes, themes, organizing patterns are all learned on the basis of lived experience, just as conscious attitudes are. So we can think more about learning straightforward learning, it's been unconscious, but learning, versus always thinking about some sort of convoluted defensive process that has been going on. So ultimately what happens is that defenses are de-emphasized
Yes.
in that framework. And straight learning, and I'm a big believer in this, that we learn, we're fabulously smart, and we learn all too well. I mean, we learn for good reasons, and unfortunately we learn things that are harmful to us and that encumber us and get in our way in terms of our living. Yeah.
The Boston Study Group of Change emphasizing the idea of procedural knowledge and learning how to do things with others, how to be with others.
Right.
That whole aspect of
Yes.
how do I make connection here?
Yes.
How do I have to be with myself and with the other
Yeah.
in order to belong here?
Yeah. Yeah, the emphasis on all those procedures that, as you know, are so intricate and that come into play in the analysis, both the analyst and the patient's implicit relational learning come in. And there's a certain amount of our own implicit relational learning that we're aware of and of playing a role. And of course, there's a lot that we're not. We can't keep it all in conscious focus.
Yes, yes. Well, I think we're used to thinking of things being out of awareness because they're defended against.
Yes.
And this material is sort of showing us that it's too vast.
That's right.
All that we know implicitly to be aware of, including our own organizing principles. There's just too much there.
It's too much. It's too much. And with regard to organizing principles, organizing patterns, I made the point at the conference that the psychoanalytic terminology that corresponds with implicit relational knowing or implicit relational procedures that are learned are such things as organizing patterns, self and object representations, that language. You can even use the object relational language, introjects, bad objects and good objects. Those are attitudes which are learned at an implicit level. And you're quite right, we tend to see them as being defensive, in terms of traditionally, as defensive formulations rather than as based upon thematic experience. And that corresponds with contemporary self-psychology, particularly with the emphasis on lived experience. And I think in contemporary psychoanalysis at large, there's much more emphasis on lived experience and on learning. And it's very exciting because an example that comes to mind is I had a couple, and the man has a penchant to blow up and get angry with his wife and to just ream her out angrily. And it's like automatic for him. And as we were exploring, and as you can anticipate, of course, we discovered that's exactly how father did it with his mother. And so several things. He didn't learn how to regulate and modulate his anger and to use it. You could talk about that. But he learned even more, a whole implicit relational way, a way of relating to his wife. It was most unfortunate, but he learned it really from his father. Both the wife and the man, her husband, both patients, were very relieved to just hear it talked about in terms of learning a relational pattern, a way of expressing the anger. It took some of the load off of him as just being out of his mind, and two, some of the anger off of her. She felt a little less angry and demeaned by him, knowing better where this came from. So it really has given us a more empathic grasp, I think, of what individuals, how much we've learned and how much that comes into play in our relationship.
So this framework of learning is a much more empathic kind of framework for the patient to say, oh, this is something that I've lived, and
Yes.
something that my body knows,
Yes.
something that's in my very being,
Yeah.
rather than the old ways that we would pathologize.
Yes.
This
Now,
kind of
I'm going to empathic, meaning that it resonates more closely
yes.
with the patient's experience.
Yes.
And it also, there's a framing in there, obviously. We construe and frame and organize things, and the organization feels less patient blaming.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, it helps to be freeing and opens up safer space for
Yes.
exploration. in
Yes.
that sort of way.
Another aspect of your example that I'd like to point out is that the patient felt relieved not only at the framing, but at something that's implicit being made explicit.
Yes.
And there's that whole sort of debate that you point out
Yes.
so beautifully in your paper on implicit and explicit, about the theorists who think of these two systems as parallel and not
Yes.
easily related, emphasizing implicit learning, the lived experience with the therapist, and those people who think of them as interpenetrating and who want to value the explication. And
Yes.
your example seems important to me about how the explication is also an experience.
Yes, yes. This topic, as you know, is a very exciting topic for me,
Yes,
and it's
yes.
a very such a relevant topic. As you said, the Boston group tends to see these two systems as parallel systems, and I think, and if they are parallel systems, then that the implicit system has to be impacted by creating new implicit relational knowing. And it needs to be done at an implicit level. And I think that they have emphasized here the importance of new relational experience, which contemporary relational approaches at large have been emphasizing for a good time. So I think it's a further corroboration of that. But I think they've inadvertently are minimizing the importance of making the implicit explicit. Now, one of the key issues with whether or not the implicit and explicit are parallel systems or interpenetrating systems is the issue of encoding. And
So we can get back to
so we can
encoding,
get back
yes.
to that. If you don't mind me
No, that's
proceeding a little
good.
bit on that, is the infant researchers and I and a number of them are very good friends of mine, but they tend to talk about that the baby initially encodes information with other than symbolic form of encoding, something that gets referred to as pre-symbolic representations, interaction structures, enactive representations. They've all seen this as pre-symbolic and based upon interaction, but they're not clear in my mind on how of specifying how that information is encoded. And I think that where there's agreement is that we know that there are two major forms of encoding: imagistic or nonverbal encoding and verbal encoding. And I haven't been able to come up with another form of encoding. And I think, as I've mentioned in my paper, that imagistic capability is present at birth, actually starts in utero, REM starts in utero, organization of sound start in utero, that famous Dr. Seuss study, that the baby is already organizing information, and I think that they're encoding it auditorily, and that's symbolic encoding, namely it serves to organize a set of experiences. It refers to a set of experiences, including affective experience. So, and Wilma Bucci and I are together on this. Wilma feels similarly that nonverbal encoding exists at birth. Interestingly, she also thinks that subsymbolic encoding uses imagistic encoding. She differentiates it between what she calls continuous processing versus categorical processing. That's a whole nother issue that we can get into, but that the subsymbolic system, and she's one, there's a few cognitive psychologists who posit that there are three major systems. Wilma Bucci is one, and she posits, the rest posit two major systems. She posits the subsymbolic, but even the subsymbolic uses the imagistic. Now, what is the importance of this? If the imagistic and the verbal are used in symbolic forms of encoding, the implication is that it would increase the referential process between those two forms of encoding. If it's symbolic encoding, either imagistically or verbally, they would have more access to one another, more reference. If it's an entirely different form of encoding, it's going to be harder to translate that or refer that into the other two forms of symbolic encoding. That's really the essential difference. Now, if it's true that both systems, the implicit and explicit, use the same modes of encoding, and the implicit system, when the verbal comes into, when there's verbal development, and it comes on slate, so that the implicit and the explicit systems organize both imagistically and non-verbally. You have the same sort of encoding with both systems. That opens the door that the two could be more intricately interrelated.
Yes.
It opens the door that the implicit is more accessible to the explicit than it would be if it's an entirely different form of encoding. So, in my own position, and it comes out of clinical experience and that theoretical issue, and is that I think that there's much more fluidity between the implicit and explicit than the Boston group's writings suggest. And if it's true, and I think also clinically, that it's vitally important that we help to make the implicit explicit, because it's only through that process that an individual can gradually, suspend that implicit relational knowing, that particular organizing pattern, long enough to be able to let in the new relational experience, the new implicit relational experience, or the new implicit and explicit relational experience, to begin to form new categories. And that's a major avenue of change.
Let me see if I
Yes,
understand
okay.
all of this.
All right.
You said a lot
I'm sorry.
here. No,
Mouthful.
it's all very, very,
Yes, okay.
very important. When you're talking about the imagistic, you're including not just pictures, but body knowing, right?
Any sensory
Auditory.
modality. Auditory is visual, auditory, touch, taste, and olfactory. That's the one we left out. Olfactory.
And
Yeah.
Genlin would include also the body
There's
sense.
visceral
not-
and proprioceptive information as well. So
Yes,
I
it's a
talk
kind
about
of gut level taking in. So
Yeah, those
we might include, in your view, we could include all of those in imagistic.
absolutely,
all of the-
absolutely. That's imagistic encoding. Yeah.
Yes, so
Now
we
the
take
imagistic,
in information not just by what is said to us,
yes,
not only through words, linear, logical, declarative, but we take it in through
we take it
our
in, but
whole living as creatures.
there's coherence and there's organization. For instance, a body memory, what we refer to as a body memory, is really a memory that's anchored in touch sense. Could be also olfactory, a sexual abuse trauma, for instance. and that memory is very organized and very coherent, but it's activated and it's lodged in this imagistic, in a combination of the imagistic modalities, if you will.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's also just stress that this that this kind of processing is an affective. We associate it with the complexity of feeling states and,
Yes.
and body knowing.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. The imagistic mentation is actually more affect loaded.
Yes.
This is right brain dominated. Right brain activity is more affect loaded than verbal or linguistic mentation.
Yes, yes.
So it's powerful. That's why these images that come forth in dreams, they're right brain processing and they carry major affect and they're very powerful affectively. Yeah.
When I might have gotten this wrong, but
Okay.
when
Okay.
I read about your imagistic thinking, the way that it seemed to me was that imagistic thinking, metaphor, affect state, actual images are kind of the border between explicit and implicit, almost like they talk both languages. That when you explore an image in a dream, that image arises out of this subsymbolic level, this implicit level, but also can be opened up through explication. So it's almost like that's the
You know, well, there's two ways of looking at it. You're right that the because the imagistic, the explicit processing uses both imagistic and verbal encoding. So when in REM dreams, imagistic mentation, all dreams use both. As we get older, when the verbal comes on board, uses both imagistic and verbal mentation variably. And REM dreams emphasize that imagistic mentation tends to be in the forefront. But when those images come forth, then we have access to them consciously, because that's a major way of encoding consciously as well.
Yes.
So that's just the point, that there's greater fluidity between the implicit and explicit because of that.
Yes,
Now,
yes.
I mentioned in this last paper that Damasio actually uses the word image. He feels that image is actually the most central form of encoding. That everything, that's the fundamental form of encoding is image. And that even as we use words, that those words, underlying the words, are mental images, are visual or use of other sensory modality images. Visual is often in the forefront, but not only.
Yes.
Now that's an interesting thought, because I think he may be right about that. That those images are so fundamental in terms of the thinking that Freud was right that was he defined it very differently. But when linguistic thought that was secondary in a sense, is a secondary process, and it's really anchored. But that's an open issue. It's a debatable issue, but it's one way of looking at it.
To make that very sort of concrete, when I'm trying to get to this implicit level with my patient, and they're describing something, I might say, is there an image that goes with that? Or is there a metaphor for that? And of course model scenes and all of that opens that up to this deeper, vaster level.
Yeah, and as you know, I quite agree to ask about images, or we ask if the patient is frightened about doing something. We ask for what's the fantasy, and a whole imagistic scenario will pop out. I'll give you an example of that. I had a patient who actually had been in a more traditional analysis and for 3 years, and things had gotten worse. And he was on the verge of losing his particular design business. And I told him, he had a consultation with me, I could see or feel what I thought was going awry, and I gave him some point. I explained it to him as best as I could and suggested that he go back and tell his analyst, and and depending upon if his analyst heard him, if they could begin working in a different way, and if it felt like it was moving fine, and if it didn't after asserting himself for the analyst, then I would suggest changing analyst. You know, that's always tricky, but I felt that this patient, he was really going down the tubes. And so at any rate, about 2 months later, he came back, and he had terminated by that time and said that he in fact had told the analyst and felt that he could not get through and it couldn't be changed. So he wanted to come into treatment with me. He, of course, was used to the couch, which I rarely use today, so he lay down on the couch. And the first session, he said he was lamenting and also the fact, and also being critical of himself about the fact that he wasn't going out to sell his business. And he wouldn't go out and knock on the door. So I asked him, I said, what do you imagine would happen if you knocked on the door? And he said, they'd shut the door on my foot. And I said, with a fantasy like that, it's only prudent to stay home. So
and how did he?
Oh, he cracked up. He got it. No one had ever said anything like that to him. That he got it. That the fantasy that he had was what was dominating the scene, and that was the problem. Inadvertently, it resulted in the second problem. He's not going out, being able to sell his business. But the real problem was the fantasy. They would close the door on his foot.
That's a wonderful illustration of the image being behind the narrative.
That's
that
right.
Is a very visual image.
Visual,
there.
absolutely visual. I got it when he said it.
Yes, that's right.
That's why it could come so spontaneously
Right.
to me and say it's only prudent to stay home.
Yes,
If you
that's
get
right.
the door slammed on your foot.
Right. And there's so much implicit in that image.
Yes.
That I can imagine the whole 10-year analysis
That's right.
unfolding.
That was
all
one
of the
major
implicit.
core issue was right there.
Oh, yeah.
That he would not be responded to. He would be responded to harshly,
Yes.
hurtfully. And with that sort of expectation, who wouldn't be
Yes.
cowed?
Well,
and who wouldn't want to stay home?
That brings up for me the issue of how explicating is also an implicit relational knowing. That when you asked to explicate this fear, it was you were enacting kind of self-object enactment of wanting to know that deeper level and supporting that deeper
Yes.
level. It was sort of like you were on the side of this implicit self, if you will.
Yes. The smart side of him that he didn't recognize as
Yes,
smart.
that's right.
Yeah. No, but
You're making an allegiance, a
Right.
bond with that level of
Yes.
him, which the explicating does.
Yes, that's right. And as you know, we find that patients and ourselves are so much more eminently sensible about such things. We're smart, but it's the problematic fantasies that we have, or the problematic implicit relational learning, what we have learned, that gets in our way. But based upon that learning, then for him to hide out in his apartment and not go out and knock on the door was eminently sensible and was the only smart thing to do. And that's often the case. And just to what you said, that whenever we're working explicitly and talking explicitly, we're focused on content, but there's the process of relating that is always going on simultaneously. And that process is what now is getting talked about as the implicit process that is going on, that at times we pay attention to, and at other times we don't. And sometimes it's important that we don't shed too much light on it, because to do so will disrupt the new implicit relational learning that is going on. Panel I was on, and a person, a well-known person, presented a dream of a patient of theirs. And the patient's dream was that she felt that she was a goldfish in a goldfish bowl, and there was a bright penetrating light shining on her. And in the goldfish bowl she wanted some cover, but couldn't find any cover to get free from that penetrating light, that uncomfortable light. To me, it just spoke so clearly. I had the same reaction as you. Wow, what a dream. That there was too much explicit light being shown by the analyst on the patient, and that light needed to be dimmed. Explicit focusing was too sharp, too harsh, and it needed to be relaxed more, and the light needed to be turned down. So, and more relating on a more fluid, less focused way. So there was a powerful image. I thought of one other image, if I may.
Yes.
Because we're talking about powerful images and what they capture. I've written about this in one of my dream papers, but it was such a striking experience. A patient of mine came into treatment. This was about 15, 20 years ago, and she was a woman in her early 50s and had come from a very aristocratic background. So the family hobnobbed with Franklin Roosevelt, that sort of level. And she was a very bright woman, but extremely constricted. She was a very fine editor, very constricted, and had never had an intimate relationship in her life, and was just shut down. So after the 3 months of treatment, she came in with a dream. And the dream was this. She said, I drove into my circular driveway in my red Porsche convertible. And my eyebrows went up, and she caught it. And that was the dream. I drove into my circular driveway in my red Porsche convertible. So she asked me, she said, you seemed surprised when I said red Porsche convertible. What would you have had me dream of? Now, an image immediately came to my mind, but the question is, do I share it or not? So I forewarned her a little bit, grabbing us both time, as well as forewarning. And I said, do you really want to know? And undaunted, she said yes. So I told her, she said, what would you have had me dream of? And I said, an Edsel. Now she got it immediately. If you remember, an Edsel was a new Ford that came out with a huge fanfare. That this was supposed to be a great new car, and it didn't take off, and it became extinct in 2 years. Now, by the Edsel, what I was referring to is all the ways that she had learned to be this constricted, to be a woman who was so constricted. And it was extinct, if you will. It was no longer servicing her well, and we should get rid of this extinct Edsel. She got that, and she smiled. And I said, clearly, when I presented that paper, audiences would break up in laughter, but also groan, because it was not a nice, quote, nice interpretation. But it captured that constricted part of her, the extinct, what should be extinct, that is no longer of use. What I was out of touch with, and what I was so surprised about, is that red Porsche convertible, the sporty side of herself, was appearing so soon. It caught me by surprise that it was coming into view so soon. That's a wonderful example of how powerful an image is, and how affectively loaded that image is. And that Porsche convertible served as a core issue throughout treatment, that her core issue was to integrate that sporty, vital side of herself.
Well,
And
hers was the leading edge, and yours was
that's
the
right.
trailing edge.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I was surprised about the leading edge emerging so quickly.
Yeah, yeah. It
And
was
she-
also like the two of you were communicating on this subsymbolic level of her image and your image.
Yes.
Not something that you had thought about so much, but just came to you, and
Yes.
and what she dreamt. And there's this communication or interaction on this
Yeah, now I'm
implicit
just going
level.
to, you're absolutely right. I'm going to be picky here because it's the terminology.
Go ahead.
Rather than subsymbolic, that we were operating both, it's a wonderful fluidity between implicit and explicit processing.
Yes.
That implicit, but it's symbolic,
Mm-hmm.
still symbolic mentation that was going on, but at an imagistic level.
Yes, yes,
Because the image of the Edsel came forth so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Think about it took me a long time to have to explain that to you, really. And that was an instantaneous image that came forth, and it captured that, all that I was trying to convey there.
Yes.
And of course, that's implicit processing.
Right, that's
doing
the
all
wonder
of
of
that.
it, that there's
That's
so
right.
much.
It's all
Yeah.
there, but it
Yes.
pops into consciousness.
That's right.
And that's where all of these intuitive hunches come from, and that's where these images, spontaneous images, come from. And writers, we all know in terms of writing that we have to incubate. We can't just, at times it will just flow out of us. We don't know where from, but it comes from all that implicit processing going on.
Yes.
And having access to that. If we become too explicitly focused, it shuts us down.
Yes.
At the same time, I know when I'm writing, for instance, I need to have free time to just let loose, not explicitly working on it, but sort of coming in and thinking about it a little bit, and all of that implicit processing going on, and letting that come in, every now and again, come into consciousness. We've all had that experience. That's it.
Yes, yes.
Or wake up in a dream at
Yes.
night. That's it.
Yes, yes, yes,
It's
yes.
a wonderful example
Yes.
of that implicit or
Donald
unconscious
Stern has
processing.
this nice phrase, courting surprise, about
Yes,
that,
right,
allowing
right.
this.
That's exactly
to-
it. Yeah, it's
to
courting
come.
surprise and being able to be open
Yes,
to that surprise.
that allowing one's permeability to,
Right.
to open and to
Yeah.
be welcoming of that.
Yes, that's the trick in terms of living, and certainly in terms of doing our work.
Oh, yes.
And both within ourselves and helping our patient in terms of that fluidity between the implicit and explicit. Notice how we're talking, though. They're not so distinctive, separate, parallel systems.
Yes.
We're talking about fluidity between the two systems.
Yes.
It's very different, and I think this is what's exciting, are these differences of opinion of how we view this.
I had really liked Luwald's statement about health is the aliveness of the link. He had said between primary process and secondary process thinking, but I think that he really was meaning what we're talking about.
Yes.
And this idea of the aliveness of the link between the implicit and explicit, the permeability that
Yeah.
gives one a feeling of self-cohesion.
Yeah, he really talked about that permeability or accessibility between id, ego, and superego.
Right,
And
which was the old language.
Which was the
for, I
old
think,
language, but it's that wonderful accessibility back and forth, the fluidity. That was their way of trying to capture
Yes,
something of what we're
yes,
talking about
yes,
today.
Yes, yes.
you know.
We're talking still, I think, about this issue of whether they're two parallel systems or whether they're linked or how they're
Very
linked,
much so,
and the linking of them. And I wanted to bring in the phrase I think I got from Genlin of, it's about, he says it's about the doing in the saying, that therapy isn't the content of what we're saying,
Yeah.
but what we're doing
Yes.
when we're saying it.
Yeah.
And I think that you're also
Yes.
talking about that it's the saying and the doing.
Yes.
That there's a doing in the saying. We could be saying one thing and doing something very,
yes,
very
that's
different.
a nice way of putting it.
But also, when what we're doing together is we're saying. And
Yes, that's right.
What we're
Right.
saying in our doing.
That's right. Saying is doing.
Saying is doing,
And,
yes.
and what we're doing in the saying, what Jenlin was talking about, both are true.
Yes.
And neither should be minimized. Both
Yes.
are important.
Yes, and I think the Boston Study Group is trying to emphasize, because it's been so de-emphasized in
Yeah.
psychoanalysis,
Yes,
that we're living together. We're
Yes.
creating a new
Yeah.
experience.
And very creatively so. But interestingly, many of them come from a more classical or traditional perspective. And I think with the emphasis on the implicit, they brought in the relational experience and the process, not the content, but the process. And as you well know, traditionally, it was top-heavy. The emphasis was
Yes.
on content rather than process, and on the explicit. So they're really helping to balance it out, and it's been desperately needed in
Yes.
traditional psychoanalysis. But those of us among the contemporary relational approaches, it just offers further validation, I think, about a lot of what we've been trying to talk about in terms of new relational experience going on. But we're doing so with, I think, more accuracy with the integration of cognitive psychology into psychoanalysis. And it makes psychoanalysis much less mysterious with these very peculiar terms like id, ego, superego.
Yeah, very experience distant.
Very experience distant, very hard to define, yeah, very experience distant. So it keeps us closer to experience, and it's very helpful. It makes contemporary psychoanalysis, it increases our explanatory grasp of our patients, and also does so in a way that helps us to be able to talk to our patients in an easily comprehensible way to them as well. So.
It occurred to me when I was reading your paper that contemporary new paradigm thinking is associated with a systems approach.
Yes.
And when we're talking about multi-systems, it's almost like we're complexifying this idea of systems. It's not just a system, a dyadic system, but there are many systems within the system.
Absolutely, absolutely. We can talk about shifting motivational systems from moment to moment, for example.
Yes.
Within the individual. So there's all sorts of systems that are occurring, the implicit system, the explicit system that are occurring, and how they are intricately involved with each other. So
It's very exciting to me how this implicit explorations are sort of furthering our kind of new paradigm thinking, going from the study in all fields of entities and things and deconstructing things to this idea of how everything is connected and the patterns of connectedness and the much more fluid way of thinking that is contemporary.
Yeah, it's true. It's much more fluid, but exponentially more complex too.
Yes,
it really is.
Yes, fluid, and not fluid in a relativistic way. Fluid in a very precise, very intricate, very patterned kind of way.
Right, right, absolutely. You know, I was thinking as you were talking that the implicit processing that is going on at times will be, I said it will range in terms of how focused it is or not, but at times it may be focused on just what we're explicitly processing. You know, for instance, if we're writing, it may be focused on that way, but all going on unconsciously. And at other times, it may be focused on something entirely different. So that when we come away from a conversation, consciously, we may have one set of feelings about that experience, but unconsciously, we sort of, to the degree that we're in touch with it, we know that there's something else was going on that we can't quite get a hold of. And that then will take, there was something else was being picked up.
Yes.
And then we get in touch with that later on. It's very similarly with dreams. At times, dreams will correspond very much with waking thought, with what we're thinking about in terms of waking thought. At other times, you can't find the linkage between waking thought. The person's not aware of it. It very well may have been the result of some implicit processing that it was occurring during waking, and then the further working on that at night. But it may diverge or be very different from waking thought.
It's a wonderful example of an experience that we consciously think is good, and then there's some other, what Jen would call felt sense. There's this whole other something, and we have to really open that up
to see what was going on at that level and what was being picked up. Jen,
I wanted to ask you, it had slipped my mind, but this is a good place to bring it in. You had said that the unthought known or unformulated experience is very difficult to access. And we've talked about it a little bit, but I wanted to ask you more about clinically, how do we facilitate the accessing of just this kind of thing? The patient comes in and says, oh yes, the blah blah was fine, but you can tell by the tone of voice that there's something else there that is completely unconscious.
Small question. In terms of getting access, as you well know, we keep, for instance, picking up on affect. We keep picking up on, if we get a sense of a theme, and then to explore that theme, if this is an experience, if this is a thematic experience, has this happened to you before, if it looks like a pattern. And we're constantly working to enlarge that issue. Actually, as we identify a particular pattern, interactional pattern, either between the patient and ourselves or the patient and someone else that they've talked about, and to pick that up as a possible theme, have you experienced this also at other times? Gradually that might open up, oh yeah, there have been other memories about that. There's access to memories of that sort, which some of which may have never been conscious before, some of them may have. And gradually that gets built up, and they gradually can develop, get a sense of something there.
That getting a sense of
getting a sense
so
of,
important.
as you know, is the is the issue of felt sense of it, and it sometimes can happen remarkably quickly, and at other times takes a long time, and it just depends upon access and fluidity, and so there's a lot of variables. You know, it related to another issue and that I write about, and that is that implicit relational learning, or implicit relational procedural learning, occurs in two different ways. From my view. One is, at times it will all happen at an unconscious level, and the child just learns something, and that's an organizing pattern. And of course, this is on the basis of the child's lived experience, and it feels like reality. This is how people are, and this is reality. That's the other. It's so difficult because all these organizing patterns feel like reality to us.
Oh yes. Well, they are our reality.
They are our reality, of course, but it's not just our reality. It feels like the reality.
Yes.
You know? But there's also encoding that takes place where it first starts out as explicit conscious process. Tennis strokes is a very good. You learn how to learn tediously to learn a tennis stroke. And gradually, or playing the piano, the same thing in terms of interacting with people. gradually that becomes implicit procedural knowledge. It becomes automatic. It operates there automatically. So those attitudes that have been formed on the basis of the second route, namely through first explicit processing, then becoming implicit, I think are going to be more accessible to the explicit
to
consciousness.
Open up.
Yes, so there's where it would increase the fluidity that you were talking about.
Yes.
How do we make the implicit explicit? And there are probably times when the implicit cannot be made explicit, and probably where there are deeper experiences that occurred at implicit level, never was explicit, and we may not be able to get access to that. That's where the Boston group would be correct, that the only way that can be that implicit relational knowing can be impacted is through different implicit relational learning that occurs in the analytic relationship.
Often the contrast of living something with the analyst that was so different than what was lived in childhood can bring
change.
But also maybe some recognition of, oh my God, I was never like this.
Yes, you're quite right about that. It's just contrasting experience will make the implicit explicit.
Yes, sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking of a consultation I had with a man. It was an Indian man. He came from India, and his mother, he described as the Queen of Sheba. He didn't realize it, but how he finally realized it was that he went to school in about the 10th grade. When he was 10 years old. So that would probably make it about the 5th grade, 4th grade. The teacher was trying to tell the students that they should do a certain amount of housework, So with that encouragement, she says, okay, so how many of you take your dishes, your plate, and put it on take it to the sink? Raise your arm. How many of you put it in a dishwasher? Raise your arm. How many of you make your bed? Raise your arm. How many of you do laundry? And so he finally realized, it was like a dawning awareness, that he was the only one raising his hand. And he realized he was doing all of where other kids didn't do that. For the first time, he recognized something is wrong with this picture. That was his reality.
Yes.
Now that's a wonderful example where the implicit came into consciousness inadvertently to him, and he became aware of it.
It's like something, the implicit is what we take for granted.
That's right. That's a nice way of putting it.
Yes.
Yeah, it's our reality is what we take for granted.
That's right. I also want to point out or mark the other things that you've said about helping to get access. This idea of opening up, that it's something that, anything that opens up this other level, and the idea of emphasizing affect.
I also think the use of the empathic mode, I mean, we've said this,
yes,
helps to really create a safe space, and helps an individual to feel sufficiently safe to articulate the experience. So that increases access. It increases fluidity between the implicit and explicit.
I think also that the empathic mode is a kind of interest in that inner, if we want to say inner self, or implicit self, that invites those experiences.
Yes, as Kohut said many years ago, is that the use of the empathic inquiry, the empathic mode, is itself therapeutic, because there's an implicit affirmation that we're interested in with the patient. I'm interested in you. I want to know what you're feeling and thinking. That's a powerful implicit procedural that is occurring there.
I sometimes will say to my students when they ask how a self-psychological approach is different than some other approaches, and sometimes I'll say, well, some other approaches want to know what's wrong with this picture, what doesn't make sense about how you you say you want this, but you're doing that, and an empathic approach is how does this make sense on another level? So it's the expectation that the analyst really wants to make emotional sense of something, and that the differently organized experience is going to be validated and valued, as you did with the man who said, well, you know, it makes sense for you to stay home.
No, I would agree. I do think that the self-psychology's contribution with the emphasis on empathic inquiry is being integrated into psychoanalysis at large, certainly contemporary psychoanalysis. And so that the American relational authors, for instance, I think will talk about empathic inquiry more than they ever used to. And so it's being integrated. I think the difference there is that they place a great deal of emphasis on repetitive enactments, as you know, and as those occur in the analytic setting, that then the analyst and patient, as they work their way out of it by explicitly focusing on the enactment, that's the way they work themselves out, and that's the new relational experience, or that's the new implicit relational learning that is occurring. But again, it's implicit and explicit relational learning that is occurring there, and that's one fundamental avenue of change. And the other avenue is closer to what the Boston group and what self-psychology has focused on, you know, where ongoing self-object experience, or ongoing regulatory
enactment.
Like self-object, or what I call vitalizing enactments, are also create change. You live it, and that creates change as well. Those are two fundamental avenues.
A point that I make in my paper is that empathic inquiry is the perfect tool for opening up the implicit level. As we sense into something, as we inquire into the feeling of something, that empathic mode that we've developed over many years has really found its home in this material about implicit processes.
Yeah, it has. It's a fundamental avenue to opening up that implicit and make it more fluidly available.
Right.
But you know, there's another. You know, I've worked on these listening perspectives and empathic
that's right.
empathic mode and the other-centered listening perspective. What it feels like to be the other in a relationship with a patient. That also opens up possible implicit processing, because if we can share that, or find a time to share that, how I'm experiencing the other at that moment, that it may open up new awareness of patterns of relating that went on in their household, which they were oblivious to themselves. The trick is to open it up in a way, in an empathically exploratory way, so that a patient doesn't feel blamed or accused or caught, you know, as if they're doing something wrong.
Yeah, I think whether we're pointing out a pattern or engaging and giving our own feeling or experience of something or making an interpretation, it's about what's evocative, what will evoke that level, and what will evoke something from the patient that will say, oh, yeah.
Yes, I agree.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Lynn.
Very, very illuminating and enlivening.
Yes, thank you, Lynn. It's a pleasure to share this with you and discuss these issues with you. And I really appreciate also your taking the time and to doing this project. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.